down there and get yourself a STEM kit for the kids. So our next speaker is someone that has been with us through a few of these festivals. And I always had the pleasure to introduce him at Lowell, and things are a little different this year. And so we're coming at you virtually. And so this is actually kind of nice. You can sit down with your dinner, a beverage of your choice, and we get to hear about caves. And so Wynne is an assistant research professor at NAU. And this topic, I mean, my middle schoolers are envious of you because you are really the real life Steve from Minecraft, going into caves and exploring. And the only difference is you're trying to conserve the environment and the living things that are in there. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
All righty, Todd, thank you so much. And without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here. Let's see.
Oh, I forgot to mention too, if you guys have a question for Jut, go to our website, scifest2020.org, and there's a question box right under, and send in a question. We'll ask it at the end of the show.
Excellent. All right, everyone. So what we're going to be speaking about today is Belize. And this is a place very near and dear to my heart. And it pretty much put me on this path of studying caves. Back in 2011, this was me. I guess about as hairy then as I am now. It was 2001. I was invited to conduct a biological inventory of a cave in Belize. At the time, I had a budding fascination with bats, and my friend who invited me to do this work told me that there was a large roost of bats in this cave, and I jumped at the chance. And I had it was my very first time of looking at caves as a scientist and examining this cave through that lens. And I was hooked. And that pretty much put me on the path to studying cave ecosystems. And fast forward to 2019, and I returned to Belize to study caves, this time at Runaway Creek. So first, I want to provide just kind of an overview summary of what we're going to be discussing today. I'll provide a brief cave biology primer. I'm going to define a few key terms and concepts for you all. We'll then discuss what is known presently about Belizean cave biology. And the next two things are pretty interesting. It's the coastal road and the current construction project, which is looking at paving this currently dirt road. And this is juxtaposed against a very ambitious project to conserve a considerable portion of forest and public lands and private lands to create a mosaic which will provide connectivity between two larger protected areas. Then I will discuss what we found during the 2019 Runaway Creek Nature Reserve expedition. And then I'll provide you all with some ideas that I've generated for future research and conservation in that area. So first, it's very important to emphasize that caves are zonal environments. And what we have here is when we look at caves, these are the four principal zones: light, twilight, transition, deep. And as you would expect, there's going to be low climatic stability here in the entrance zone, because as the sun comes up, it's going to heat the ground surface. It's also and that's going to influence the climate here in the entrance. As the sun goes down, then again, you will see the changes will be felt in the entrance zone. However, at the deepest part of the cave, that's where we have the highest climatic stability. And in what we call the deep zone, it's typically characterized by having a near stable temperature. So there's very little fluctuation in temperature. It has little to no airflow, and the atmosphere is near water saturated. You can see the walls will be dripping in water. There will probably be water dripping from the ceiling. There could be standing water in that part of the cave. And the way that we always can tell as a scientist, when you go in there and well, it's not very scientific, but it's just a telltale way of knowing that you're in the deep zone. You exhale and you can see your breath. And so you know that you're in the deep zone, and also you can smell it. So once you've been in that working cave long enough, you can actually tell when you're nearing the deep zone. So when it comes to evolution of animals in subterranean ecosystems, the same situation occurs here in terms of a specialization for the cave environment. In the entrance, the inhabitants will have a low level of specialization for the cave environment. And when you get to the deepest part, this is where we have high levels of subterranean adaptation. Animals that are very tightly connected to the cave ecosystem and cannot occur on the surface. So they occur only within caves. So now let's look at the different functional groups that occur within caves. The first of which, and these are technical terms for cave biologists, the first of which is called a troglobiont. And this is an animal that is highly specialized. It's adapted to the subterranean realm. And this is a classic example of subterranean adaptation. Here, you can see the animal is depigmented. It's this yellowish, whitish color. It's either eyeless or has highly reduced eyes, which is indicative of the animal is on that evolutionary path, perhaps towards complete adaptation and eye loss. And it also has elongated appendages and antennae. And it's a little difficult to see in this image. But you can see that there's these they're typically very hairy, or they're covered in hair or seedy. And that becomes one of their sensory apparatus underground. So it enables them to see, if you will, underground. The other functional group, or the other example here, is when we're looking at aquatics, it's called a stegobiont. And a stegobiont is simply a troglobiont's counterpart. So it's a subterranean adapted aquatic organism. Our next group are called troglazines. Now, troglazines are animals that require the cave for at least a portion of their life cycle. And the best two examples that I have for you all are bats and crickets. And these animals will either roost or den in caves during the day and will return to the surface at night to forage. Our final functional group are called troglophiles. Now, troglophiles are animals that can complete their life cycle underground, but can also be found in similar cave-like surface environments. So, for example, underneath a fallen log or within a talus slope, they're essentially seeking out those areas that are suitable to their that are suitable habitat for them. And for these troglophiles, it's typically, once again, cave-like environments. They're typically higher humidity. And that's one of the environmental variables that they're selecting for when they are found in these type of habitats. So I consider myself a conservation ecologist first and foremost, and these are some of the reasons why caves are so very important for us to protect and conserve. First off, they typically yield numerous undescribed animals that are new to science. And you can see here by this little very short list here of things that I've been involved with. Describing new species is pretty much the name of the game for cave biology. If you're among the first researchers to go in and sample a cave for the very first time, you're most likely going to find new species. And oftentimes those animals, those troglobionts and stegobionts, those animals that are restricted to the subterranean environment, those animals are typically what we call short range or narrow range endemic species, meaning that they might occur in that one cave or within an aquifer or within a specific geographical region, like a karst formation, a limestone formation, and no place else on the planet. So as a result of this, it's quite common that a lot of these areas are identified as hotspots for endemism and biological diversity. When it comes to bats, I cannot emphasize enough how incredibly important bats are for ecosystems and for us. Bats are considered keystone species for cave ecosystems. This is an image of bats, Mexican free-tailed bat colony from El Malpais National Monument in New Mexico. At least, tens of thousands here, maybe 20,000-ish. And you would, as you can see here, when there's this many animals and they're defecating within the cave, they're bringing the nutrients from the surface into the cave. So if you remove this colony from the ecological equation, well, that can dramatically alter the cave ecosystem. Bats are also keystone species in tropical forests. They are seed dispersers of tropical plants, and they're also pollinators. And finally, they provide humans with free ecological services. There was a study in 2011 by the US Department of Agriculture where they estimated that bats in the United States provided at least $3.7 billion in ecological services per year. And that was largely estimated based upon the number of agricultural pests that they consume. So bats are tremendously important to cave ecosystems, to surface ecosystems, and to us. This was a paper that we published last year in Bioscience, and the reason I'm sharing this with you all is this is one of the key topics that we covered in this paper. As you can see here, it was a scientist warning on the conservation of subterranean ecosystems. And basically this was a clarion call where we were elucidating all the things that we need to be aware of in order to best protect subterranean ecosystems. And two of the primary impacts that we are most concerned with cave ecosystems is habitat loss and climate change. And these are not unique to cave ecosystems. These are impacts that are plaguing surface ecosystems as well, but they are plaguing cave ecosystems to a fair degree, and it's something that we have to really be aware of moving forward. Now we're going to turn our attention to looking to examining what we know about Belize cave biology. And when we're looking at cave roosting bats, well, in Belize, in total, there are 72 different species of bats known to occur within the country of Belize. Of those, 33 roost in caves. And these represent 13 of those, or 39%, are pollinators, and 55% of those are seed dispersers. So you can see here just out of the gate that protecting caves will promote ecological health of native ecosystems in Belize. And within Runaway Creek Nature Reserve proper, 4 of the 5 cave roosting bat species that have been identified to date are identified as species of concern. Regarding the subterranean adapted animals, this is what we know about based upon 3 studies that have been conducted to date. And if you think about it, that's really not a lot of work that's been done in Belize. For an entire country to only have 3 cave studies that have been published to date, it's pretty astounding, really. But what we know about from those 3 studies is that there have been 141 different cave-dwelling arthropod species that have been identified through those efforts. And of those, we have at least 28 troglobionts, those subterranean adapted animals. And of those, 17 of those animals have been formally described. And by formally described, I mean, we have there's been a paper published about that animal. And that's really important from a conservation perspective, because if we don't have a name associated with the animal, it can't be recognized by the IUCN Red List to protect it if it needs protection, or even to evaluate it for protection. So this is Belize here, and what we have in this red polygon here, this is Runaway Creek Nature Reserve. This is the Maya Forest Corridor that I mentioned. And this is the coastal road. So these are the 3 key actors in our play this evening: the Runaway Creek Nature Reserve, the Maya Forest Corridor, and the Coastal Road. So starting with the Coastal Road, this is what it looked like in July of 2019. This is in some places, the vegetation had overgrown into the road so much to where it was only passable for one vehicle. And this is not considered a barrier for animals. Animals freely have been crossing this because vehicles can't drive fast on it. This has been a fairly poorly maintained road. Great for wildlife though, and great for birding. We would routinely stop going to and from Runaway Creek to bird, to identify what we saw in the trees and what we saw in the cleared areas along the roadside here. We also saw a troop of coati that were crossing the road. It's also known that jaguar and tapir and other animals will freely cross this road. Well, this is what it looks like now. This is a 37-mile stretch, was once a Brigadoon road and is soon to be a paved road. This brings with it all sorts of problems. The impacts I've listed here, there's likely to be increased poaching along the roadside, increased animal vehicle collisions, logging, tourism, development. You pave a road and folks are going to want to have a restaurant to stop along the 37-mile stretch to get something to eat. Convenience stores are going to pop up, gas stations, etc. Most likely more settlements of folks moving in to populate the area along this road corridor. The southern, as you saw in the map that I showed earlier, the southern extent of Runaway Creek is very close to this road. So we believe that all of these impacts that are listed here, all these right now listed as potential impacts, are destined to ultimately impact Runaway Creek. This is the Yucatan Peninsula here, and the purpose of this Maya Forest Corridor is basically to connect this 16,000 square mile area, which is known as La Selva Maya, which is in this general area here, Mexico, southern Mexico, northern Guatemala, and a sliver of Belize, and the Maya Mountains, which is a 150 square mile area here. And the Maya Forest Corridor is a 21 square mile, or I'm sorry, a 32 square mile corridor, which is which purpose is largely to provide connectivity between these larger protected areas, and largely for our charismatic megafauna, such as jaguar, in particular jaguar. So this is Runaway Creek Nature Reserve, and firstly, I just have to say this is an amazing part of the world. This I have had the opportunity and the good fortune to be able to work in a lot of places all over the world, and this by far was just simply amazing. The diversity was astounding. These are some of the stats on what we know thus far: 315 different bird species, 35 reptile and amphibians, 40 different butterfly species, at least 15 species of fish. All 5 wildcats occur within Runaway Creek, tapirs, howler monkeys, spider monkeys, and, you know, for me, caves, and a lot of them. And this is something that was really neat for us. This occurred our very first day in the field. We hiked into the hills. I showed an image earlier, but I really didn't touch upon the different types of habitats. But the lowland is flat, and it's this pine savanna. And in the hill country where the caves are, there are these limestone hills. And that's where the broadleaf tropical forest occurs. And that's where animals like this are to be found. However, in 2010, there was Hurricane Richard hit Belize, bringing winds of 95 miles per hour plus, and heavy rains. Many trees were downed in Runaway Creek, and it was largely believed at the time that howler monkeys, the population of resident howlers, were wiped out from that storm. And very first day we went there, and we saw a pair of howler monkeys. So this was the first time that howler monkeys were observed since 2010. So that was pretty exciting for us. And this is the work that we did. This is just a summary of our objectives for the study of 5 caves within Runaway Creek. First, we collected arthropods within the cave deep zones. As I mentioned earlier, the deepest part of the cave where we're most likely to encounter subterranean adapted animals. And by extension, those animals are most likely to be those of the highest management concern. We also had set out to document all the bats that we observed both within caves, and we initially had planned to trap bats and identify them in hand. However, when we arrived in the middle of the maternity roost season, so we shifted to just counting bats emerging from their roosts. And we also wanted to document all other wildlife sign. And we did that via either direct observation or using trail cameras, which we placed both within caves and facing into the caves. So first, let's go over some of the preliminary results for the arthropods, or invertebrates, because we did have a handful of worms and gastropods as well. These are really neat animals. These are whip scorpions, or amblyopygids, and they look very menacing because they're pedipalps. They have these claws or basically spines, and however, when they're very docile. You can actually capture, if you're fast enough to capture them, you can actually hold them in your hand, and they're very gentle. But these are the 3 different species that we think we have 3 different species that we encountered based on our work there. This is a tailless whip scorpion, and we have a big fat question mark as to whether or not it's subterranean adapted. All tailless whip scorpions are eyeless. Most all of them have this tawny, brownish, reddish color to them, which is also somewhat characteristic of subterranean adapted animals. And this is going to require being thoroughly examined by a taxonomist, who can then look at the degree of CD on the animal and compare it to other closely related species and see whether or not it is indeed subterranean adapted. The same story goes for this critter here. This is Simoidea. This is Harvestman, or Opilianus is the group that it belongs to. This is also, we believe it could be a troglobiont, but then again, all the animals with all the species within this group do have these little beady eyes, and they are often depigmented like this yellowish color. So once again, this is going to need to be examined by a specialist to make that determination. This one I'm a little more confident with. This was, and we actually looked at this under a microscope. This is a spider. This is indeed eyeless. You can see that it's clearly depigmented. It was covered in CD, had elongated appendages. So, it checked all the boxes in terms of being troglomorphic. This is a terrestrial isopod, or roly-poly, and it does appear to have elongated antenna. Once again, this will need to be thoroughly examined by a specialist to make the determination whether or not it is indeed subterranean adapted. When it comes to animals like this, and you'll see with some of the millipede images that I'm going to share with you in a second, a lot of these animals are also soil dwelling or leaf litter dwelling animals. And if they occur within the soil or within the leaf litter, it's the same type of situation in terms of there's not a need for pigmentation. It's energetically costly, so they're often depigmented. And also having eyes is energetically costly if you live in the leaf litter or you live within the soil. So those are the sort of things that we need to tease apart when we're looking at these animals in terms of describing them for really knowing whether or not they're subterranean adapted or if they just occur underground, if you will. This is a millipede. Once again, we don't know if this is a troglophile or if it is actually a troglobionte. This is an animal that is probably a troglophile. This is a juvenile, oftentimes with several different groups of families of millipedes. What we will see is that they are depigmented in the juvenile stage, and that they acquire the pigmentation upon reaching adulthood. So this is what we're seeing. This could be a troglophile. It could complete its life cycle underground, and it probably does, given where we found it. This was one of my favorite animals. I actually spent about a half an hour just watching one of these move across the cave floor. This is a diplurin. Campodiidae is the family, also known as a bristletail. And the animal you can see here in this particular image, because it has these cerci, these tail characters that are about, oh my gosh, almost 3 times the length of the body. And when it moved through the cave, it moved with this sweeping manner as it moved across the floor, perhaps looking for prey, perhaps looking for mates, perhaps looking for a place to hide because there was a bright light being shined upon the animal. But it was absolutely fascinating. So based on the tail characters, the fact that it's depigmented, the fact that it does have elongated antenna here, I'm quite confident in saying that this animal is subterranean adapted. This is a subterranean adapted springtail of the family Entomobriidae. You can see here that the antennae are almost twice the length of the body. The animal is eyeless, completely depigmented. Just another classic example of subterranean adaptation. Really neat animal. These are crickets of the family of Rhamphitophoridae, probably troglophilic. I mentioned earlier that some are troglozenic and that they will den in caves during the day and exit at night. But it's not cut and dry, and ecology very rarely is. What we have here is these animals, they also will complete their life cycles underground. You can see this is a breeding pair here. It is quite likely that that the female will lay her eggs within the cave, and that the nymphs will emerge, and that there is a viable population underground. This is a mycetophilid larva. And let me show you the other image here. Here's a better image of the actual larva itself. And these are also called webworms. You might be familiar with them from in other parts of the world, New Zealand in particular. They're called glowworms. And what they are is they are flies. And in their larval state, here's this one here. In its larval state, what it does is it creates this webbing. And you can see that it is covered in this sticky mucousy fluid from the animal. And what it will do is it will hang out literally on a web above it, and these tendrils below, when something flies into it, the animal is able to sense where it flew into it, and it will descend quickly and capture the prey and consume it. This was something that was really neat. And if I was able to have a live audience in person, I would say, what do you think this is? What this is Maya shadow art. This was absolutely, oh gosh, this was just so amazing to me. It absolutely blew my mind. So what we have here is, you can see what they did was they modified the speleothem. The ancient Maya did. And what would happen, and what you can see here, so this is kind of like the head of the bat. These are the tips of the wings. And when you shined a light in the right direction towards this speleothem, it would cast a shadow on the wall that would look exactly like a roosting bat. And there were several of these within the cave that were modified in this manner. And the presence of the Maya underground is oh gosh, it's omnipresent. It's everywhere in if you go into a cave in Mesoamerica, you're going to find evidence of Maya occupation or use. This cosmology within the Maya cosmology, what they believe is caves provide access points to Xibalba, which is the Maya underworld. And that's where the gods reside. And that's where, and so there's a lot of really, it's intrinsically important to the Maya people. And so what they would do is, when they would go into caves, they would do things of this nature. They would modify the speleothems in a way to make this a more intense experience for those entering into Xibalba. So obviously that was my segue into bats. So what we have here is we have some bats roosting on the ceiling here, very spread out. And when we actually go into the results here of what we found, these are phyllostomid bats are very difficult to identify on the wall. But what we were able to discern was that when you look at this bat here, you can see this little protrusion here is actually a pup. And you can see, so mama has a baby. And that was the case for most of the bats that we encountered. This is a small harem of what we were able to discern as gray stripe-faced bats. And you can see here, this is the male. This was pretty neat. He was being very territorial here when I was shining the light on him. He was actually, doing this as I was shining the light on him, trying to photograph this small harem. And both of these, this one's difficult to discern here, but this female here, she has a pup as well. These are lesser dog-like bats, and you can see here that she is with a pup as well. And so you can see here that we were able in some cases to identify some of the bats as species, but this is what we're doing mostly in terms of identifying the bats and well, not really identifying the bats, but just getting a very rough, very fuzzy idea in terms of the numbers of bats. So what we did is we conducted a very abbreviated counts, exit counts. We had a very small amount of time to do a lot of work. So ideally, if we were going to count bats, we would have been better funded. And we would have had an IR camera to do actual emergent counts where we would have just left the camera and collected the data and not been in this situation where we have three big scary animals in the entrance of the cave as the bats are exiting.
All right, this is day 3 of night operations sampling for bats. That's Nico. He was swatting furiously to try to keep the mosquitoes off of him. I just got bit. This is our cave. And we're waiting for the bats to begin to emerge. Oh, and that's Stefan.
Hi.
All right. It's the team. And we're going to be sitting here counting bats probably for the next hour or so. And unfortunately, nothing really cool is calling while I'm recording this. So that's kind of a bummer. Waiting. Those are just crickets, right, Stefan?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Ooh, plain chakalakos, right?
Red Lord Parrot.
What?
Red Lord Parrot.
Sweet. Okay, Red Lord parrots just flew over. I thought they were plain chakalakos. Chachalakas. Sweet. All right, signing off for a bit.
So that was another aspect of this work, is that the team that I had was just absolutely amazing, incredibly knowledgeable. I basically attended Jungle University for my time there. And these guys knew the jungle, and both of them had extensive experience working as field ornithologists. And so whenever I heard something, I could just point up and say, "What's that?" And 9 times out of 10, Stefan or Nico were able to identify it to species. So I learned so much while I was down there. It was such a treat. So this is us here in front of the cave, getting ready to count bats. In the interest of full disclosure here, I have a very high lumen light that I'm shining into the cave. It was the best we could do under the circumstances, because basically we had to adjust fire once we got into the field, because as soon as we saw bats with a lot of pups, I knew that erecting nets in front of the entrances to catch bats was probably not a good idea, because it would cause undue stress to both the mother bats and to the pups. And so what we had to do was we decided to conduct emergent counts so we could get a rough understanding in terms of the abundance of bats. So the way that we did that was by blaring this bright light into the cave entrance. So there is the possibility, and I suspect it's quite likely, that we were augmenting behavior with this approach. And what you're going to hear us discussing here is I'm going to be asking him whether or not the bats actually left, because what we see here initially is the bats kind of swarming around the entrance. And as it grows darker,
Looks like at this point, they're largely using the lower entrance.
as it grows darker, what will happen is they will ultimately start exiting. But then what will happen is, well, as bats do, they will be going back and forth to the roost. And we were also documenting the returns to the roosts as well. Oh, and this is an abandoned termite nest right here with the machete sticking through it.
That one go?
So it literally took 3 pairs of eyes to look at both the lower entrance here, the upper entrance, and see what was going on in terms of the bats exiting. So now we're moving on to the observations and the use of trail cameras. This is a really neat image here. What happened was Stefan was working with us, and well, Stefan had the weekend off, so he took off to Belmopan, and he took the rope with him, which we were using to tether the trail cameras to the posts. So the jungle will provide. So what these guys did was, well, we just grabbed some rhododendron roots that were coming down from pretty much everywhere in front of the cave, and we just used that as our twine for fastening the trail camera to the sapling that we cut down and used as a post. So in terms of direct observations, these are tungora frogs or mud puddle frogs. And as the name implies, if it's wet and muddy, you're very likely to encounter them. We encountered them in 4 of the 5 caves that we went to, very right at home in terms of use of the cave. It is possible that they're reproducing in the cave, or they might be troglazines in terms of using the cave during the hottest, drier parts of the day, and then they exit at night when it's cooler and perhaps more favorable, or once the rains start, then they exit the cave entirely. We don't know exactly how these animals are using the caves, but they were indeed present within 4 or 5 of the caves that we sampled. This is a Lesson's motmot, really neat bird. So I was actually able to photograph the bird outside the cave entrance, which getting these type of images, you can see it's somewhat grainy, but still pretty darn good. Photographing birds, animals, any sort of wildlife in general in a dense canopy is always challenging. And fortunately, this particular bird was willing to pose for a photograph. This is the results of the trail camera. We knew that they were using the cave entrance. There was a nest within the entrance. We actually had about, oh gosh, what was it? It was 20 different images with various shots of the Lesson's motmot within it from the trail camera. And then of course I was dive bombed about, oh gosh, pretty much every time I went to the cave, I was dive bombed by at least one of these birds. So, they were being very territorial while we were there. These are gray four-eyed possums. And this is a really neat shot. You can see here, you can see that there are, here's a litter of babies riding on the mother's back. We encountered possums quite often within the caves. We had them in 3 of the 5 caves. And when we were doing emergent counts one night, we saw a gray four-eyed opossum basically ascend a near vertical cliff wall at the entrance, or cave wall rather, within the entrance of the cave. And it's possible and quite likely that in some cases they're using the cave as habitat, because we found them using one of the areas that we set up a camera within, a large burrow. And we also found them within the cave entrances. And there's an anecdotal report by Fiona Reed, who wrote the book on, mammals of southern Mexico and Central America. And she reported that that the gray four-eyed possums arrived when bats that were trapped in mist nets were emitting distress calls. So we, putting two and two together, it's likely that they also hunt bats within caves. Here's where it gets really neat. We had in pretty much all the caves that we went to, we had evidence of jaguar. So this is a jaguar paw here at left, and in two of the caves we had puma tracks, and in 3 of the 5 caves we had Morlitz crocodiles. This is tracks. There were skid marks into some of the burrows within the caves, and that prompted us to put the cameras in front of some of these burrows that we thought that they were using. Excuse me. Here's a trail camera image of a jaguar. Here's a better image of a jaguar from right out in front of the cave. And this is really neat. This is a tunnel cave directly above one of our caves that we sampled, that we had a video camera in. And this is the first cub that was documented within Runaway Creek. So cool, we got to show it twice. All right. Almost 3 times. And this is an image of a puma within a cave. And this is what we believe that they were doing. We believe that they were hunting paca. In all 5 caves that we were sampling, we saw paca tracks throughout the entrance into the twilight, and in some cases into the deep zone of caves. We also believe it's quite likely that the Morlitz crocodiles, because from what we could discern, it does appear that they are using 3 of the caves year round, and they're primarily fish eating animals. And we believe that they could very well shift to paca during the drier times of the year when fish are not abundant. Because as you can see in some of these images that I'll show here, here's one example. There's another that one of the cave walls just have heavy scalloping where water and dirt and rock have moved through the cave. A lot of these caves, or pretty much all the caves that we went to during this study, they are prone to flooding. And thus, fish will come with the flooding. There's also likely that they will be brought up as the water table rises as well. And we believe that there could be the crocodiles could shift between fish and paca. So here's a summary of the total diversities per cave, rather than list the names, just to protect the names of the caves. I'm just listing them as 1 through 5. You can see here that, fairly similar diversity across the caves in terms of both invertebrates and wildlife. This one, it was one that was not a true cave. It was more of a shelter cave. And because we did see evidence of both jaguar and paca within it, we decided to set up a trail camera and also conduct observations for wildlife. But we did not sample for arthropods, nor did we sample for bats. This is a pie chart of what we have in terms of our invertebrate diversity. And I shifted from calling them arthropods to calling them invertebrates, because we have both snails and worms here. And as I mentioned earlier, we didn't sample all caves. We sampled 4 of the 5 caves, and we had 22 different groups are identified here in this pie chart. Of those, we have at least 64 different species, or I guess morphospecies, because we didn't identify all down to species. And of those, at least 16 are subterranean adapted invertebrates. In terms of bat abundance, and this is based on those emergence counts that we conducted, you can see here that the first 2 caves that we went to are quite similar in terms of the number of individuals, and the last 2 caves had quite a bit fewer in terms of the number of observations of bats. So turning our attention to the conservation and management aspect here, I can't emphasize enough that most cave roosting bat species are highly sensitive to disturbance, and in particular human use of caves. And that's something that I recognize as a researcher, that when I go into caves that I'm having an impact. And that's why we try to change our research design. Given the things that we encounter, we're planning on misnetting bats. All of a sudden the bats are gravid, or rather they have pups. So it's not a good idea to handle bats at that time. So we shifted to emergence counts. So we have to be aware of that in terms of their sensitivity. And in terms of conservation, I would really like to see more. I would like to see efforts heightened to promote the importance of Belizean bats. And this is something that both conservation, non-governmental organizations in country can do, and also something the Belize Zoo is certainly able to do. And that is just adding bats to the very long list of animals that they're trying to conserve and protect through outreach, because of the importance to both the surface ecosystems and to the cave ecosystems. And this is something that I think about pretty much every time I enter a cave is just the effects of climate change. Global climate change is, we're experiencing it here in the North Country, where we're seeing, perhaps the worst monsoon, at least since I've been here. And when we see these very dry, warm conditions, that has an impact on caves. That ripples into the cave ecosystem. So what was once suitable habitat for a given animal or population of animals may be deemed ultimately unsuitable. So maternity roosts, there's a certain humidity threshold within which these bats will select for. There is a certain temperature threshold within which these bats will select for. So as temperature increases and droughts increase and that alters the hydrological regime within a cave, we could very well see some of these maternity roosts becoming unsuitable. This is the example of the scalloped walls that I was talking about earlier. You can see just this was all done by water and rock and dirt. And you can see very high volumes of it based on how smooth some of these surfaces are. But in terms of research and management, first I would like, we were planning on doing it this year, but that little thing called the pandemic intervened, is to intensively sample for invertebrates within the caves. What we conducted back in 2019 was simply just a baseline study. We just went to the deepest part of the caves and looked for the pretties, if you will, the animals that were subterranean adapted and most likely to be of conservation and management concern. But we want to conduct an intensive sampling effort to get a better grasp in terms of the animals that are occurring within the caves. Also sampling the pools of water for aquatic species, both stagobionts, the subterranean aquatic, the animals that are subterranean adapted, which are aquatic dwelling. And we unfortunately were unable to do that. There was several pools of water that we encountered within these caves. One of them was actually chocked full of fish. They did not appear to be subterranean adapted. And it was also one of the caves that had crocodiles within it. So it was most likely that they were feeding on the fish within that pool as well. But very important to go back and sample that to get a firmer grasp on not only what are the fish species within the cave, but are there any subterranean adapted aquatic species within those pools as well? Long-term deployment of trail cameras, that's something that we should do, both to obtain a firmer baseline in terms of the animals that are using the caves, and also to start monitoring. And because once the coastal road is paved, there could very well be changes in terms of usage of these caves. We might see a downtick in usage by species. We might see an uptick. For example, maybe the jaguars are driven away. They're not able to cross the road like they used to. And so we're seeing fewer within Runaway Creek. Maybe because of the road, they're driven into Runaway Creek and they're occurring in higher densities. Who knows? Who knows exactly what's going to happen once the road is paved? But we can start to formulate some hypotheses and use these strategies here to start to collect some of the data to address those hypotheses. Also, this is something that I believe is critically important, is to develop a cave resource management plan for the preserve, so they will have a plan moving forward into the future. And that is something that can only be done once we have a substantial data set that we can use to draw inference in terms of populations of different types of animals, as well as usage by different species of animals. And nested within that cave resource management plan would be a monitoring strategy. I alluded to this earlier with using the jaguar example, but through the development of a resource management plan, through the collection of a robust data set, we can identify species which would require monitoring in the long term. And that's something that's going to become even more important once the road is paved. And these are some things kind of writ large for the reserve in terms of bracing for a paved coastal road. This is something that they're currently working on. As I mentioned earlier, the southern extent of Runaway Creek is almost bordered by the forest. There is a sliver of private land between Runaway Creek and the road. The idea is to purchase those lands for the reserve to create a buffer zone. This is something that much to my chagrin is not being explored by the Belizean government or being addressed by any of the NGOs, at least presently. And that's based on the last discussions that I've had with folks, and this was about 6+ months ago, is the development of wildlife overpasses to enable larger animals to be able to cross the road. Underpasses, some of the culverts could be modified to promote the usage by smaller animals. That's something that should be also explored. As I mentioned earlier, this lowland savanna here is prone to flooding. So during certain times of the year, the culverts might not be passable by some animals, but these are the sort of things that need to be fully explored and really developed to best promote connectivity for both sides of the road, and to best ensure that Runaway Creek is the natural resources at Runaway Creek are protected, and the conservation of those resources are promoted to the fullest extent. And this is something that I did not mention earlier when I was showing the image of the Maya Forest Corridor, and that is the Maya Forest Corridor. Pretty much the crown gem of the corridor is Runaway Creek Nature Reserve. So this is very important to the corridor. So we need to pull out all the stops in terms of finding ways to promote the protection of the animals that are presently occurring within Runaway Creek, and as well as promote the protection of the habitats in which they rely upon. This was a little disconcerting. This happened the very last night of our bat work at Runaway Creek. It was the last night of the project. We're leaving. Lo and behold, we see a truck within the boundaries of the reserve. And this was a poacher. And the guys that I was working with, they indicated that they thought that they were probably just there hunting paca. You can see the guys were a little smart here. There is no license plate. There was nothing within the dashboard or anything. I didn't rummage through the vehicle, but I did kind of look around to see if I could see anything that we could get a name off of the vehicle. But they were presumably, they were poachers. And what's going to happen when the road is paved is that this is going to be a more common occurrence within Runaway Creek. So ultimately, a 24-hour presence within the reserve will be required. Not necessarily to stop poaching, but at least having a human presence within the park may help deter some of the poaching. And I've tried to provide a balance of gloom and doom with optimism here within this talk, but the paving of the road, it's really difficult to find any silver lining. It's not going to be good for Runaway Creek. It's not going to be good for that corridor. It's going to create a whole new slew of challenges for both Runaway Creek and for the Maya Forest corridor. But here's a small ray of hope. This is Michael Cowell, also known as Jair. That's what his dad calls him. And we gave him a slew of nicknames while in the field. Mobley, Jaguar Boy, Jaguar Boys because his father is the Jaguar Man. And but this is Jair, and Jair was with us for a good percentage of the field work. He was with us at night. You can see him, attentively watching me take notes. He asked a lot of questions concerning what I was doing, how I was doing this, why am I doing this, why am I not doing that? And so we could very well be looking at, the next leading conservation ecologist for Belize. And this is the way I would like to end this talk, is just looking to the future and seeing that there are folks that are doing very important work on the ground to try to make a difference. There are people working tirelessly to make the Maya Forest corridor a success. And, we have young people that are interested in the work and could very well be representing the next generation of conservation biologists in Belize. And I always say, I'm one person speaking, but I would not be here if it were not for my team and for all of the support that I received for this work. This work was well supported by Runaway Creek Nature Reserve, the Belize Zoo Neotropical Conservancy, Cave Research Foundation, National Speleological Society, the Belize Zoo. All of them in aggregate made this work happen. And I thank them all very much for making that happen. And with that, Bantioks, which is Kachik Maya for thank you very much. And with that, I can hand it back to Todd.
All right, that was a great presentation. We do have a few questions for you. So I'm going to go ahead and start asking those. We have Lupe in Flagstaff, and Lupe was wondering, are there any of these cool arthropods or insects in caves that are here in northern Arizona?
Yes, there are a lot. Well, I wouldn't say there are a lot. Let's just do this real quick. So I've done quite a bit of work. I really cut my teeth in northern Arizona. I worked up on North Rim Grand Canyon for 10 years doing this sort of work. And we'll do a quick screen share here with you guys. This is from a different presentation, but you get the flavor here. So this is Runaway Creek Nature Reserve. Y'all are familiar with this. This is Grand Canyon Parashant National Monument. And this was within the context of an ecological concept called a latitudinal diversity gradient. So we're looking at how diversity differs as you move away from the equator, right? And what we're seeing here is this is based on 6 caves on Grand Canyon Parashant, 7 subterranean adapted organisms or arthropods. Belize, much closer to the equator, double that number, and we had fewer caves. So this just gives you an idea when we just look at the diversity and how diversity differs when you go from one latitude to the next.
Oh, amazing. We have a Tab from Winslow. Does the camera flash affect the bats or hurt the bats in any way?
I wouldn't think they like it. To be a little curt, we can't ask the bats, right? It's like, hey, did you like that dude, or was that really annoying? It's kind of difficult to tell, and given that it's just a second of a flash, and we capture that image, it's really difficult to tell whether or not that's affected their behavior. There are other approaches that we can take. And as part of a longer term monitoring strategy, I'm highly recommending that we use infrared. And that does not emit a flash like a color image would. Granted, you won't get, really impressive images of jaguars and being able to see the color of the animal, but you will be able to say, yes, that is a jaguar. And it will have it will be less annoying, if I can anthropomorphize what the bats are feeling when a light goes off. But we really don't know. But in the interest of just trying to reduce our impacts, using IR using an infrared camera system would be the best way to do it.
And that sort of answers David Ross's question from Flagstaff, which he says, great presentation, by the way, but the idea of using night vision goggles to observe things in caves, if that's been kind of considered as a possibility.
So yes, it not necessarily night vision goggles, but I'm sure that it probably has been used. But another way of doing it is using an infrared camera, infrared videography. So actually setting up an infrared camera facing the entrance of the cave and just hitting play and collecting the data. Or you can obviously set it up on a timer and collect it between a certain window, or also a motion sensed approach is possible as well. But that has been done. One of the caveats to that approach is that you have to fastidiously sit and count each bat in each frame. We don't have an algorithm that can go through a video and spit out 60 bats at the end of the video. So that's a little problematic. And then also, as you saw from the snippet that I shared with you all, when you have bats returning into the cave, that's something obviously that would also have to be addressed. Is how do we statistically and meaningfully exclude the returns to the roost?
Kind of on the same idea of light and observation. You mentioned that a lot of these arthropods and organisms that are in there have no eyes. Mm-hmm. But yet you mentioned that when you would shine a bright light at them, there might have been a possibility it was trying to either get away from the light. Do you know of any ways that they might be able to sense light without eyes?
Well, physiologically, I should know the answer to that question, and thanks for dinging me there, Todd. But yeah, it's called phototaxis, and we do know that they do sense the light. They do have receptors on their body that detect different stimuli, and we do know that they are when a light is shined on them, that the first thing that they do is they try to get away from the light. Yeah. Exactly what's going on, what part of the animal's anatomy is driving that? What is it? What the receptor is? Is it the CD? Is it a receptor on the body? Where is it? What is it doing? I don't know, but I will find out, because I try to reduce looking goofy.
Oh no.
No, but and that's something else too. I think for the viewers at home to recognize is we don't know everything. Scientists don't know everything. And what we don't know, by virtue of being a scientist, we're typically very curious people. And if we don't know something, then we have to go look it up and return. I'm doing a paper right now on evolution of subterranean adapted animals. And I do have to say, based on the research I've done thus far to create this manuscript, I've not seen anything specifically addressing that. I'm not saying that it hasn't been addressed, but I haven't encountered anything that has addressed it specifically. We have looked at, for example, studies that look at, and we mean scientists in general, have done studies where they look at basically torturing the subterranean adapted animal. They put in a box and they make the conditions drier and they make the conditions warmer or cooler, and they see how the animal responds.
Mhm.
And they have been able to identify, thresholds for which, the Goldilocks spots, if you will, what is just right for the animal. And we do know that, a near water saturated environment is very important for a lot of subterranean adapted animals. We do know that they are affected by temperature, and that if it gets too warm, that is something that adversely affects them, and that they basically seek shelter from, to get away from a warmer conditions. Obviously, if they're in a box being tortured, they're unable to get away from it. But we do know that they don't like it.
And caves tend to have stable temperature gradients, don't they? I guess and I'm thinking of the Lava River Cave here in Flagstaff. It's pretty much a good stable 55 most of the year. You could go in; it's cool in the summer or warm in the winter, depending on when you go. Is that pretty much similar?
That's a really great question, Todd. So yes, in a lot of cases, caves are very. They do have the deepest parts of the caves are stable in terms of temperature, and typically stable in terms of the being a near water saturated environment. However, in areas that are more variable, that's something that the cave will experience as well. So surface variability will ultimately be felt in the cave. For example, Northern Arizona, Painted Desert area, I was working in a cave, and it just so happened that it was one of the wettest times of year. There was water dripping down the walls, and when I went in to set the traps for the arthropods, I was like, that's where we put the traps. We put the traps where the water is pooling. And we put baits down and traps, and lo and behold, we found an animal that's only been observed once in that cave. And they were these mites that had antenna forms. Their forelimbs were modified into antenna, and they were like 5 times the length of the body. And they were clearly subterranean adapted animals. And they only came out into the cave environment when the conditions were appropriate. Now, what that provided for us, albeit anecdotally, but it's something that has been examined within an experimental context as well, is that these animals are actually there, and that's why you heard me refer to them as subterranean adapted. They're not cave adapted.
Mm-hmm.
The caves are the places that big clunky humans can get into. But those cracks and crevices, what we call mesocaverns, those tiny spaces within the rock, that's where those animals, that's their primary habitat. And when the conditions in places that are more variable, like Northern Arizona, when the conditions become unfavorable habitat, those animals will retreat into those mesocaverns and find that Goldilocks spot. When the conditions are favorable in the cave, well, they're just kind of moving around, and they're like, oh, okay, well, this works. I like this. I can do this. And you'll find them in the more open spaces within the caves.
Oh, awesome. Going back to conservation and the bats, something I thought of when you were talking about the coastal road that was being built and all the sort of things that it may bring with it that are not so nice to preserving ecosystems. How does light pollution factor into bat colonies? It's something we try to keep down here in Flagstaff, mainly because of the night sky. But there is an ecological component to light pollution, and I'm wondering if there's been any studies that might talk about bats, light pollution, and what it might do to a cave ecosystem.
So bats are known to emerge for foraging at different times, right? At different times of the night. And that's why what I was doing with the emergence counts were basically just a very brief snapshot in terms of what was going on. We would really need to be there for 4 or 5 hours to really do a thorough job. And that's because it gets progressively darker as the night as you move it into the night. And so with that in mind, we do know that there are certain species of bats that are lunar phobic. that will drastically curtail their nighttime activities. And it's mostly because of predator avoidance. They don't want to get picked off by owls and other predators that could pick them off at night. So we do see changes in behavior, and with light pollution, increased light pollution, yes, I would think that could very well augment behavior. But my goodness, the flip side of that is I remember growing up as a kid in South Georgia. We'd always go to the street lights in my neighborhood to watch the bats hawking the moths.
Yeah.
So yeah. So granted, I never, not to say that it didn't happen, but I never observed an owl in the area. But maybe the cost outweighed the risk, right?
Yeah.
They're like, this is an easy meal. I'm definitely going to do this. And there was this aggregation of bats that were there because of the moths. But in general, yes, you do see a correlation between light pollution. I wouldn't say you do. I would expect to see a correlation between a light dome and bat activity, and I would think that would have to have some effect.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with any studies that have specifically addressed that question, but I'd be astounded if there hasn't been.
Yeah. I have another probably, biological, mechanical question. You brought up how pigment is sort of energetically taxing. And I was just curious, what about that what about pigment makes it energetically taxing for species that are evolving in a primarily subterranean environment?
That they don't need the pigmentation, right? So pigmentation in animals is used for a number of things, right? To attract mates.
Mm-hmm.
You see the bird with very bright colors. What is it doing? What is the male doing? You see the males are typically the ones that are very colorful. The females are typically less, more of a drab color. And with insects, it's also conveying, danger. You eat me, you could die. And then you see mimicry that animals that aren't poisonous that will have similar coloration patterns to mimic the animals that do. So in an area where there is complete darkness, those sort of cues are not necessary.
Okay.
So evolution over time has figured that out, that it is energetically costly to invest in coloration patterns when that energy that could be put into other things like more hair on the body, more seeding, elongated limbs, elongated antenna. And obviously those are things that are done incrementally over time, right? By a natural selection. And mutation, genetic drift, and things of that nature.
Well, one more question for you. If we had a wealthy person watching this show, and they were going to just give you a blank check for something in the future for you to work on, what would be on the top of your wish list with that blank check?
Oh gosh, if only that would happen. There's so much. I would. I'm stumped. I really am. If someone offered me a blank check, I would have to make something up really quick, and I guess that's what I'll do here. There's something that I've been wanting to do for a while, and that is I've been working on developing and testing systematic techniques for sampling animals within caves, and then using that information to develop vulnerability assessments to determine how vulnerable a given cave is to human activities that are occurring at proximity to that cave. So first you collect the data and you say, wow, this cave has an impressive biological diversity of organisms and we need to protect it. Lo and behold, upstream, there is a limestone quarry, or on top of it is a limestone quarry.
Yeah.
So yeah, being able to fully develop that into a framework which could be tweaked and modified to be applied on a at a global scale would be magnificent, because we could develop it and test it, and then put it out, birth it to the world, and then it could be picked up by folks in other parts of the world and modified and used as needed. Actually, that was a project that I tried to launch many years ago, which was unsuccessful. So yes, that certainly comes to mind.
Well, if we have any Bill Gates or Elon Musk watching right now, there it is. It's on the list. So
You know how to find me.
yeah. So Jet, I want to thank you so much for this amazing presentation. Every year, it's got all of us that just wonder about these places, these very independent and isolated places. It's like an undiscovered world still. And so thank you for bringing that to us virtually. I want to thank our viewers for sticking with us and watching this and enjoying the research that Jet's been doing on caves. Also, if you could go to the survey link and let us know how we're doing, that's on the same webpage. I want to thank our team in the background, Morgan and Paul, our production engineers, and Greg Vaughn from the USGS, who was my backup host in case my internet died. So thank you guys all for joining. Jet, great presentation. We'll see you next year, hopefully at Lowell, to interact in person, but this virtual thing is pretty cool too.
Let's hope it happens next year.
Yeah. All right. Bye, everyone.
Take care. Thanks, everybody.